Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jesse Richard, and on behalf of Everbridge, I'm excited to present this webinar, Improving Disaster and Crisis Management, Plans and Exercises for Timely Communications and Response. During this event, we will hear from emergency management and continuity planning expert, Regina Phelps, who will discuss tips and best practices for developing some simple communication tools and processes, as well as how to exercise them to improve disaster and crisis management. Following Regina, we will hear from Claudia Dent, who will give us a brief overview of Everbridge and how you can leverage critical communication solutions to improve disaster and crisis response. After the presentations, we'll have a brief Q&A with our speakers. We encourage everyone to participate and ask questions during the webinar. You can submit your questions by typing in the questions widget and submitting to all panelists. Links to the slides and recording of the webinar will be sent out to all registrants at the beginning of next week. You can also look for a link to the recordings for all of our webinars on everbridge.com under our resources section. And now I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. Regina Phelps is an internationally recognized expert in the field of emergency management and continuity planning. Since 1982, she has provided consultation and educational speaking services to clients in 4 continents. She is founder of Emergency Management and Safety Solutions, a consulting company specializing in incident management, exercise design, and continuity and pandemic planning. Ms. Phelps is a frequent top-rated speaker at well-known conferences such as the Disaster Recovery Journal, CPNM, and the World Conference on Disaster Management. She is frequently sought out for a common sense approach and clear and clean delivery of complex topics. After Regina, we will hear from Claudia Dent, of Product Management and Product Marketing here at Everbridge. Claudia has many years in experience in the technology industry and has held executive positions in product management, marketing, business development, and general management at companies ranging from startups to large global enterprises. And now, without further ado, I would like to pass it over to Regina. Regina, you are all set.
Great. Thank you, Jesse, for that kind introduction. Let's get started here. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be with all of you today to talk about this concept of plans and exercises to build a timely communication response. Now, this, of course, applies to not just communications professionals, but probably everybody on this call. So whether you're a business continuity management person, an IT disaster recovery professional, or in crisis communications, each and every one of us has skin in the game, if you will. We all have a stake in having timely communications. In my professional career, I've never had any of our clients say to us after a disaster, "Oh my gosh, we communicated way too much." I never hear that. What I'm more likely to hear is things such as, "Gosh, people didn't know what to do," or "Our communication was slow and ineffective," or "We didn't have enough information to communicate, so we didn't," and the approval process slowed us down, and so on and so on. Really, the goal of my talk today is to discuss ways of streamlining this process and the team that drives it, and then exercising it to see if it works. So I have a lot of things on my agenda, as you can see, so let's just jump right in and get started. I want to talk, first of all, about communications at time of disaster. Now, when you stop and think about it, organizations have tremendous issues at time of disaster. And one of the biggest ones, of course, is communication. And many times communication is delayed because of uncertainty. People don't have enough information. I hear that over and over from our clients. We don't know what to say. We don't know enough. And sometimes it's just not clear about what should be said. And so that really stops and slows down communication in many organizations. And to that end, it's critical when you stop and think about what you need. You must have clarity about several things before you can communicate. Ideally, you know who talks to whom, when they're supposed to, how they're going to do it, and what's being communicated. And that's really what I'm going to focus my comments on today. Because as we all know, if communications is not timely, especially in this day of social media in particular will fill in a communication vacuum rapidly. Well-meaning employees in your organization may feel like they just have to make up information or take what has been told them and extrapolate on it because they don't have enough to tell key stakeholders. And sometimes employees will actually vote with their feet, which may mean evacuate or leave a facility because they don't hear timely messages from you. And they're seeing and hearing things on Twitter and also on the internet. And so it just makes it more complicated. So communications must be timely. And what we have found the solution to really be is two things. One is, first of all, having a really solid communications team, a plan, and then an identified and clearly exercised response. The second part is really streamlining the communication process by making sure it's crystal clear who talks to who, when they do that, how they do that, and what you're communicating. And that's really going to be the focus of my talk today, are those two key points. As we know, communication really is guided by what we call the 6 C's. I believe this guides not only crisis communications, but crisis response, incident response. The first is command and control. We have to have an organized response with crystal clarity about who is in charge and who is in control. What we're looking for in a communication response is consistency. We want to make darn sure that every department or group is really speaking off of the same identified talking points, and we sound like we are all marching in the same direction. This requires a lot of collaboration, and this collaboration doesn't happen spontaneously. It requires pre-identified processes, thoughts, and practices in order to make it work, because we have to coordinate messaging. And then once we've done 1 through 5, we should be communicating in every possible vehicle we have, utilizing all of our contemporary tools in order to basically spread our message wide and far. Before we get too far, I want to just stop for a moment and just have 2 definitions to come back to so that we're all kind of on the same page here together. And the first one is crisis management, and you can also say crisis communications based on my topic here today as well. But really what crisis management is, as we well know, is a process for what any organization utilizes to deal with an unpredictable event. Something that's going to harm the organization or company, its stakeholders, or possibly even the general public. And there are 3 things that this crisis has in common. First of all is the threat to the organization. And we're talking generally about a significant threat. That could be physical, it could be something like a cyber event, but it has to be a significant threat. The second is an element of surprise. Now, you may have, for example, in your profile, risk profile, earthquakes, and you're planning for them and ready for them, but it's always, of course, a surprise when it occurs. And then lastly, there's a short amount of time to make decisions, tremendous pressure to make decisions. And when you put all 3 of those things together, a significant threat to the organization, a surprise that the event has occurred, and tremendous pressure to make decisions and therefore communicate, that puts a lot of pressure on our organization and our ability to communicate and manage. Secondarily is reputation. Reputation is closely tied, of course, to crisis communications and crisis management, and reputation is simply the opinion of a group of individuals or entities towards a person or a group, and it adds 3 elements. Your reputation, your organization's reputation, is not defined by you. It's actually defined by others. So if you don't handle a crisis event well, you will be judged harshly by the people that are looking at you. It's also a very effective mechanism of social control because most organizations, most people want to have a good reputation. So it helps sort of keep us in social control, if you will. And it also is one of the fundamental instruments of social order because we want to have this good reputation. So when you think about that in context of crisis, what you're not only responsible for in your business is very likely the resumption of business, both in business continuity and IT recovery, but also helping to maintain the reputation of the organization. And we do that very commonly by how we communicate. So let's talk about some communications basics that I'm going to focus on here today. And these are the 4 major aspects of what I want to talk about. First of all, who's on your communications team? How is that group organized? What are the team roles and responsibilities? And then how do you develop some sort of communication schedule and who puts that all together? Those are 4 really important areas of communications, and I'm going to peel each one of them back. Now, the first one is the communications team. Now, you may say that's blatantly obvious. I know exactly who's on that. And for most people, they would think of this. The communications team, of course, whether you call it corporate communications or something like that. But you probably also might have something like public relations or investor relations or possibly marketing and sales. Those are the obvious people whose job title is communication. But I would bet there's a lot of other people who are talking to other folks. And that list might look like this: information technology. Certainly in a cyber event or an IT outage, they have lots of skin in the game. What about human resources, and what are you saying to all of your internal partners? What about your key lines of business? Who do they talk to? And how are they managing that communication? IT, information security, business continuity. Are there others? And I would bet if you actually step away for a moment and think about communication being a broader situation in your company, that list of communicators expands. And when you think about that, then the question is, how are you organized? Number 2 on my list. Now, there's a very common way that I see how communications teams are organized, and that is that they're very separated. So they're separated by exactly the groups I just spoke about. So you have business lines, you have HR, you have IT, and then you've got all the communicators. But they're all in their individual silos. Now, that presents a lot of challenges, and it's one of the reasons in many organizations why communication is so slow. How do you share information in a timely manner between all of those entities? And then how are you ensuring that it's consistent or timeless? I mean, that is really important. And I will tell you, when everybody is in their own little bucket, it's very hard to do that. So what you see in the public sector, and increasingly you see also in larger companies, is something called a JIC, a Joint Information Center. Just what we need is one more acronym in our life. But a JIC is a great thing. It is a huge plus, because if you actually take all those folks I mentioned just a bit ago, the communications, the marketing, the public relations, the investor relations, the HR, the business continuity, the key lines of business, IT, and so on, and you put them together, what you have is the ability for them to work together to solve consistency and timeless problems in communication. However, it's not all smooth sailing, I'll be honest with you. In the JICs that we've established in companies, there are often a lot of bumps in the road when they first get started. The first one is turf. I mean, who tells who what to do? Oh my gosh, when you combine all those different departments, it sometimes can be challenging. There's also sometimes a fear of the loss of autonomy when you combine everybody together. HR wants to be HR, and IT wants to be IT. And how can they be under this big umbrella called communications? Well, actually, I have to say to you, it really does work effectively, because if you stop and think about it, they all are doing very much the same thing. So to go to that point, let's talk about the roles and responsibilities of the team, because there's a lot they have to do. Now, the traditional roles of communication teams are this. So first of all, and this is what you would see the classic corporate communications, public relations entities doing within your organization and company. They're acting as the communication advisors for both tactical and strategic teams. So your incident management team, the tactical team, your executives in an executive crisis management team. They're assisting them in being able to develop communication and strategy about how to respond. They're also preparing, for the most part, most internal and external communications, hoping for consistency. They might be updating your website. That could be your internal and external websites. Monitoring the media, including the internet and social media. That is a huge topic all by itself, and how do you do that? Organizing media interviews and briefings and keeping the media informed of what you're doing. Preparing executives who might be on camera doing interviews so that they are presenting the image that you want your company to have. But they're also gathering all of the information from all the sources, and they also have to validate that and verify it to make sure that it's correct. And then what they want to do is they need to also analyze that information and prioritize it for release in this particular incident. There's a certain amount of rumor control that they might need to be doing so that you can make sure that indeed you're keeping your finger on the pulse of what's happening. They might also be setting up investigations briefing, talking to the people on the street about what's happening to your company. How are they managing it? Again, remember, we're trying to manage our reputation. They might also then set up and run the traditional media center for a large organization who's having a significant issue. Those are all of our usual communication roles. But I would actually even boil those down a little bit more as I talk. The key thing I'd like you to think about is, first of all, who is in charge of all of these communications activities, especially if you engage other departments like IT, key lines of business, human resources, and so on. It may be somebody out of communications, but not necessarily. So that's the first question and the first sometimes stumbling block in how you organize what's called a JIC. The next thing is about authority. Now I'm going to talk a lot about this later, but this is really who approves messaging. And this is one of the biggest stumbling blocks that we see in most of our clients. But then there's three other very distinct roles and responsibilities that are encapsulating a lot of what I just spoke about. And it really is these three: gathering and verifying information, developing and coordinating information, and then distributing that information and evaluating its effectiveness. Now, what I would say to you is, if you still remain having all of your communicators spread throughout your organization, I would say to you that each one of them is doing all of this. And when you stop and think about it, it's really ineffective. Because if HR is doing that, and IT is doing that, and the key lines of business are doing that, and oh, by the way, all of the communicators are doing that, we've wasted a lot of time. And we still don't necessarily have a consistent message. So what I want to do is I'd like to talk about these three roles and think about your own communication process in your company or organization and ask the question, how are we doing this? How are we doing these three things in order to be accurate, timely, effective in our communication response? So let's start first of all with the one that's known as gather and verify information. Now, the first thing that has to happen is that you really do have to gather a lot of information. And that's done, as we know, from a variety of different ways. The first thing is that you will be actually, of course, reaching out to individuals in your organization to find out what's going on. And again, that could be many of the folks that I've just ticked on my little fingers here: HR, IT, key lines of business, the communicators, it could be government relations, it could be some of your key management team. Who else? Who are the key individuals in your organization where data is likely to come from? And also key departments. And some of our clients, for example, in banking, they have a short list of those people they need to go to immediately, right now, in order to find out what's happening to the business overall so they can begin to communicate effectively. You might be getting information from public and government agencies, and that could include public responders such as police and fire. It could also include federal agencies such as FEMA, or if you're in Canada, the RCMP, those individuals and agencies that have information that will help us. So who are those? Then another one would be media monitoring, because there's a lot of information that's going on out there on the web in particular. How are you tracking all of that? How are you going to gather all of that so that you can, again, be informed and prepare accurate communications? And that also gets to social media monitoring, which is increasingly more important. Utilizing that as a way of finding out what is being said about this organization, as well as the crisis that you're dealing with. So those are the first things you have to figure out. Who gathers the information? How is that shared? If we're all operating in our separate silos, everybody is kind of doing the same thing or seeing it from their own vantage point. The plus of having your communicators all together is that this can be assigned to an individual or two or three. You are the team that gathers information. Another part of their process in gathering information is verifying it. And how do you do that? How do you know that what you're receiving is actually accurate? That takes a little bit of skill. You might have other members in the communications team. They sort of compare notes about what they're hearing. There might be incident management team members or your crisis management team, section chiefs, and others who you might be asking to confirm. You might be talking to other agencies, for example, fire and police, to validate the information. There might be people in the field, your staff even, who are finding out information and being able to validate what you've heard. And then the media as well. Although, as we all know from watching the media, sometimes that's not necessarily a good and valid way to verify. But you need to figure out, now that you've gathered the information, how can you accurately say that it's right, or to the best of your knowledge that it's right? And what you want is a small group of people, ideally, whose job is to gather and then verify the information. So that's one group. Now, the second part is actually, in many cases, a totally different group. Again, within a JIC. So if you imagine you're in a joint information center, you've got lots of different communicators. We have one group of people, your job, go find out what's happening and validate that. Another group is now going to actually be, if you will, our writers, if you will. So develop and coordinate the information. Now, they have two very important jobs. The first one is establishing key messaging. And these are really, think of these as your main talking points. And what they are, the key things that you will be sending out to a large number of folks within your organization, more than likely, so they can develop their own messaging, but it's based on your key talking points. The mission of having quickly developed talking points validated with the information that's been gathered is that what we're trying to do is get in front of the information. The mission of having the right talking points is to get the right information, what we're saying about our situation, to the right people at the right time, and so they can make the right decisions. Now, this is an important issue, and you can design an exercise solely around this, and I'll talk more about exercises at the end, but I want to give a shout out for this. What I find in many organizations that we work with is that this skill of developing talking points, having them quickly approved, is a very slow process, either because they're not focused on it initially or they get bogged down. You should clearly have identified key messaging already in your templates, and you take it out at time of disaster, you modify and change it, you quickly go through the approval process, which we'll talk about when I talk about governance. And what you'll do then is be able to then disseminate those key talking points to a large number of people who need them in order to communicate with employees and customers and other entities. The slower you are in doing that, people will just make it up, and that's a problem. So what is your key messaging? The number one activity of this group under develop and coordinate. The second thing is getting the appropriate approval. And I'll talk a lot about that when I talk about governance, but what you need to do is, certainly if you've activated your crisis management team, if you're utilizing the incident command system, you'll notice in my slide I utilize the term incident commander, the IC. You want to make sure that all key messaging has been seen and approved by your incident commander, or whatever you call the name of the person who's in charge of your crisis management team, incident management team. And what we're looking for in this process is streamlined approval, which I'll talk a lot about when I get to governance. But we want to make sure that the key messaging has been delivered, and by the way, it should not be on a white piece of paper. You should already have key messages that you're just going to modify it on the fly. Then you're going to get them approved through that quick process that you have, and ideally every one of these messages should be seen by the incident commander. So step 2, critically important, develop and coordinate that information. But we can't do that before we've done step 1. And then what we do in what I call step 3 is really distribute the information. So the next step is, now that I've got the information written, and I got my talking points, and I got it approved, I'm ready to go, well then who am I giving this to? So that means we have to know, first of all, who the audience is. Now you may say, well, that's blatantly obvious. I would challenge you, I bet it's not. Every group has different lists. Who are those folks? Who's the person in charge of talking to those people? What kind of tools are you using? Are you utilizing email? What if your email system is down? What other systems might you have available to you? Utilizing multiple methods in case in the emergency you don't have the option. And I will give you a really good example of that. If you look at a cyber-related event, such as a serious case of a malware infection in your company's systems, and there has been a decision to disconnect from the internet, not an uncommon response. Very likely that will disable your email system, and very likely might even disable your website. How are you going to communicate to your employees? And one of the things I tell all of my clients is use your emergency notification system. I find that most of our clients do not use it to its full potential. The primary purpose they use an ENS for, an emergency notification system, is for their employees. And I say, wow, that's a big mistake. You should be having lists of your vendors, maybe a whole list of all the news agencies that you communicate with, maybe a list of all your key critical customers. Who are the key stakeholders that you need to communicate with? Why aren't they in individualized groups within your ENS? That gives you a lot of flexibility, an ability to quickly disseminate the information, and if you have a problem technology-wise, wow, it still goes out. That's huge. And then you want to think about the media. How are you going to be actually sending this out through media channels? Would you use contemporary media channels such as Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or other types of vehicles like that? Would you also then use the contemporary media, and how would you go about that? Would you send out a release? Would you actually have a press conference? What would you do? And that's all part of the monitoring of the media, but also the dissemination of it. And then once you've done that, you think, gosh, we're done. Well, no, you're not really done, because you have to evaluate how you did. Because if you just keep throwing messaging out there and you don't know if it did any good, then it's really kind of a waste. You could be saying things that sound brilliant to you, but they're not really helping. So how are you doing? And so that might be a feedback loop that you're actually following with social media, contemporary media. You might be reaching back to customers. The idea is, how are you making sure that people are getting your message and actually being able to do something with it as you want them to. So it tells you if you got your message right. It also tells you if you need to say things differently, because maybe you're saying things in a way that your customers, your key constituents can't understand or don't get. And then lastly, there should be some sort of continuous feedback loop so that we're constantly evaluating how our communications are doing, because we want to be good at this. And if you don't ask the question, how are we doing, you'll never know. So those three steps are all critically important. And this really gets back to the team structure. How can you effectively do all three of those things that I just mentioned? Gather and verify information, develop and coordinate it, and then distribute it and evaluate it. And what I would say to you is that the more centralized your communication response can be within your organization, the better off you are. So this concept of a JIC, bringing all key communicators together under one umbrella, can be a huge time saver. We've even done this in really small not-for-profit organizations that have just literally even 100 people, but they have 3 people that communicate. They all put them together. And the bigger the organization, you can have a much, of course, bigger JIC. But what you want to do is identify who needs to communicate, and then you want to actually, ideally to the best of your ability, house them together. Now, we've talked about the team roles and responsibilities, and we've talked about the process, and we've talked about how we're going to go about actually doing this communication task. But there's a couple of key things that I would like you to think about in the area of governance. Now, we in my organization, we do a lot of audits of business continuity programs, and one of the things we often look at is the governance policy for the business continuity management program. As part of that, there should be a governance document for communications. And let me talk a little bit about this, because I would hope that many of you have this, but I don't see them very often when we are working with clients. So let me just talk about what I would love to see in yours. First of all, this communication governance document, it should be a relatively short document, but it should have very clear guidelines about 2 things. One is the approval process, and the other is the role of communication in your organization. Approval process and roles. Now, what I'd like to see when I see that document is I want to see a couple things. What's the role of the senior executives? What do they do? Are they the ones that approve key messaging? Are they identified as being a key spokesperson? Do they convene about communications, and if so, when and why and how? So you need to really peel that back. What's the role of the crisis or incident management team, which is the more tactical team? Are they where the JIC is, or the Joint Information Center, or where your communicators are? How do they come together, and what's the process for messaging there? Which then ties to what I've been talking about already, which is the role of all those other company communicators. And then you want to make sure that you've got clear communication actions tied to incident levels. So what does that mean? Most organizations will utilize, just as in IT and business continuity, some sort of level system to describe the event. And maybe it's a level 1, 2, or 3. Maybe level 1 is a minor event. Level 2 is something with more moderate. Level 3 might be catastrophic. It's often the reverse in technology, where a SEV 1 is the most significant and a SEV 3 would be least. But I would love to see, literally, where you've identified what are those key levels, which you should already have on your incident or crisis management plan. And then what are the communication actions you expect in each one of those levels, and who has the authority to actually do what? That would be very important to have some approval in advance, which gets to my last issue, which how the heck do you communicate, approve any of your communications? That is often the biggest stumbling block in the area of communication, which then gets to a little bit more about what should be inside this document. A stated governance policy is what I'm really looking for here. So the goal of a governance policy is to ensure that communications are well coordinated and effectively managed, and that it's responsive to the needs of the company's stakeholders. So who has the authority to approve messaging? Does it have to go all the way up to your CEO? Does it have to be seen by legal? Does it have to be seen by the key departments responsible for that? The goal is that you will have this clearly delineated. And let me give you an example of that. When you look at the objective of this communications governance document and responsibility, what we're trying to do is to be so clear in establishing responsibility. Because if you haven't had this conversation in the past, and you have an incident that occurs today, you will be gridlocked because no one will move forward, because no one knows exactly who's responsible. Does legal have to look at everything? Does your CEO have to look at everything? Does every department have to sign off on it? You need to have all of that spelled out. And you need to have that spelled out in these three examples. So, for example, who has the authority during an emergency in your company to have a message delivered? So generally speaking, in most organizations, if it is true emergency response, life safety, who's responsible for that in your organization? Generally speaking, that is your security department, maybe facilities. And it should be very clear that they have the authority in a case of emergency response, fire alarms, workplace violence, hazardous materials spill, tornado, whatever it is, and they don't ask for permission. They have some pre-approved messaging, and they send that out. So whether that's sent out through the emergency notification system or in a public address system, that should be clearly done without any qualms at all. Then the next thing you want to look at is, what about the tactical situations in which communication would be appropriate? So, for example, we're activating our business continuity plans. We're going to our alternate site, and clear instructions about what people are supposed to do, work from home, whatever. What needs to be approved? Those tactical messages, we all know they are, very likely would be, could be written now and actually approved by whatever entities those need to be. So they simply have to be pulled out at the time of the emergency and then blessed by either the incident commander or whomever is on your governance document and sent out. The more strategic situations are the ones that really generally require more hand-wringing and opining by the part of legal and certainly by the executives. What you want to do is, those are the ones in particular that you want to clearly pull out from these other communications so that people can be timely. And if you can actually do separate them in that fashion, where it's an emergency response, clear responsibility who has to do that, and you give examples of those. Tactical communications, stay home, go to the alternate site, activate your business continuity plan, whatever those tactical messaging is for your employees. And then the third ones, the strategic ones, the ones that are more the ones that the executives want to really dig into and chew on, those should be delineated differently. When you do that and you really talk about communication, approval, and authority for each one of those, it becomes much easier. So when we write a governance document for communication, we very clearly will almost always have emergency response. Who has the authority to approve? Whoever's in charge of that. So it'd be security, facilities, whomever that department is. In tactical situations, as far as who's approving those messaging, most commonly it would be the incident commander, the person in charge of the incident or crisis management team. And then in the strategic situations, that would be very likely where you would have your CEO or your executive team that would actually be the individuals who approve and have the authority for messaging. But tease those apart, and your governance document can help you do that. And by the way, once you've written the governance document, you want to then present it to your executive team, and you want to make sure that they clearly understand it, and you want to get approval for them so that they are not holding up any emergency communications, or for that matter, tactical communications during an incident. The strategic ones that require their thought and pay grade, so to speak, those are the ones that you want to make sure that they are actually utilizing and following. This also ties to another document that we are very keen on companies having. We don't see this very often either. So in addition to a governance document, I think you'd find great help in having a communication matrix. So what the heck is that? That's actually identifying basically four basic things. First of all, who are the stakeholders? So who is the receiver of your message? So think of all the key stakeholders in your life. It's your employees, it could be your customers, it could be your vendors, it could be the media and different entities within that. It could be regulators. It could be folks that are dealing with certain aspects of your business. Who are they? Really line those out. So put them under major headers, and I'll give you an example here in just a moment. And then fill out who sits below that. Then I'd like to know who owns that relationship. Who's the company owner of that relationship with that stakeholder? So I can quickly look at this matrix and say, oh yes, obviously employees are owned by HR, or investor relations owns communications to these key investor groups, and so on. Then I'm really curious about the communication tools that they use. How are they going to communicate to all of these entities? So would they use email? Would they use things such as a text message or a press release, or would they send out a tweet? How are you going to communicate with all these folks? It's done differently for many of those different entities. And then lastly, what's the first thing you're going to say during most emergencies? Now you may say, Regina, there's no way I know what I'm going to say. Well, you know, frankly, I bet you do. If you stop and think about it, once an incident is first announced, there's a lot of things you don't know. But obviously people are beginning to become aware that there's a problem. And maybe the first messaging is something to the effect of, we're aware of an incident, we're investigating, and we'll get back with you, or something along those lines. But what are the first things you're going to say? Because if you haven't thought about that, when the bad thing happens, you're going to hem and haw about what you're supposed to say. And that's inevitably what hangs people up when they're trying to be effective and timely in their communication, is that they don't know what to say. And it's not rocket science. The first messaging is pretty straightforward for almost any incident. Something's happened, we're investigating, we're going to get back to you. And you may throw in things like, we're working with emergency responders if that's appropriate. But that's really what we all would say at the beginning, and that, if nothing else, buys you a little bit of time, which in this day and age is actually really important. What the matrix might look like is something like this. I have 3 of the 4 columns here, and this is just to give you an example. So maybe, for example, under our stakeholder number 1, we have employees as our stakeholder, and then we've got the relationship owners, HR, and they use a variety of things to talk with their folks: employee hotlines, the website, notification system, company email. They might use Facebook and Twitter. Our clients or customers, maybe that's the relationship that might be individual business units. So you'd actually see, for example, sales and marketing or manufacturing or whoever it is that owns that relationship, and you see the tools that they use. We have our board of directors. Our relationship owner would be likely the CEO and maybe the comms team. Very likely that would be pretty simple communications by phone or email. Maybe regulators, maybe individual business units have that responsibility. And again, pretty simple communications. The investor community, investor relations would commonly own that, and there'd be 3 possibilities there. Maybe our suppliers or vendors, purchasing might have that relationship, and then how they communicate with them. So really the way to actually do one of these matrices is to pull together our communicators, which we've already talked about, but identify who those are in your organization, and then literally whiteboard this. Who are the stakeholders? Who owns that? And what are the tools that we most commonly use to communicate with them? Pretty straightforward. Very effective. The next thing on my list is the communication plan. Now, a communication plan very commonly has several different topics. You've got the internal preparation, which I would want to see the policy. I would want to see who's on the communication team. I'd like to see who does what. That goes back to the three things I mentioned earlier. Gather and verify, develop and coordinate, and then disseminate and evaluate. Who does all those things, and how does that work? How does notification occur in your organization? I'd like to have that clearly delineated. Who notifies whom? What tools are they using? How does that work? Hopefully you're utilizing your emergency notification system to do something like that. I'd like to know how this communication team, however you've developed it, assembles, where they go. So where is their JIC or their communications team going to stand up? And then lastly, a really important thing I would like to see broadly written in the communications plan is situational assessment, which is literally how are they finding out what the heck is going on? What are all of their potential situational assessment tools? Because how do you get situational awareness? And if you're not clear about that, but that is another, by the way, great topic for an exercise. How do you get situational awareness? How do you know what's going on? And really identifying those entities, which could be the logical ones like the media and the emergency responders, but it could be other groups, departments, vendors, entities, who, how. Because if you don't know, you're kind of drinking out of a fire hose and you're not sure what you're doing, and that's the problem. So those are the basic things that I would expect to see in my crisis communications plan, but there's a few others. I would like to see some notation about how to develop key messaging. And again, I would really hope that this is not a white piece of paper. I would like to see very good examples, lots of templates that are situational appropriate about how to develop these key talking points, key messaging. I would also like to be very clear about the documentation and record keeping. How long do we keep things? That's where legal will very likely need to opine with you. Where do we keep our documentation? How long do we keep it? What do we do with it? I'd also like to see a whole thing about notification and communication, which again, if you had a matrix, would actually solve all of that, because you would know all of those key stakeholders and you would know who does what to whom. I'd like to also then have a good sense about your media positioning and strategies. How do you refine your messaging? How do you evaluate your messaging? Are you only talking about traditional media? What about your social media platforms and exposures? How are we doing communication updates as your event unfolds? Do you establish a briefing schedule and stick with that? Do you have modifications or changes to that? How do you actually evaluate that this is all working in real time is really important. And then after the event is over, what's the cleanup, if you will? What are the strategies that you have to do that? Those are the common things that you would want to see when you actually look at your communication plan overall. Now, the last thing I want to talk about that was in my 4 major topic areas today is the communication schedule. And this is another one that I find that people just they're too reactive and they don't stop and actually do planning. And again, if you're utilizing something like the incident command system, which is built around something called an operational period, this should be familiar to you. And if you're not, you might want to certainly at least embrace that concept. So the communication schedule is really important, and it's built around operational periods. So what does an operational period mean? What happens when your team first assembles is they develop an action plan. If you're using ICS, that's called an incident action plan. And the action plan simply is this: what's going on, who's doing what, and when do we come back and report our status. That's called an operational period. So the way to think of an operational period in the area of communication is think about it as 2 goalposts. Literally what you've got is you've got a beginning part of the operational period. You run for a period of several hours, if not longer, and then the actual operational period ends. Think of it as a goalpost. In between those 2 goals, those 2 vertical lines, you have a lot of tasks that need to get done. And if you clearly, as a communicator, understand what the operational periods are, you build your comm schedule around those operational periods. So once we know what the operational period is, then literally we can drop in all the communication tasks that need to get done within that operational period. Because if you stop and think about it, once the operational period has begun, now we are actually all working on the action plan. And you as a communicator, you know what everybody's doing because it's written in the written in the incident action plan. We understand what facilities is doing, and IT, and HR, and all of that. And we see that. And we see what their work plan is over time. We also now can schedule our briefings because once we finish the incident action plan and we're into the operational period, we can brief our executives. We can schedule all of our communication. And we can now begin to push out talking points. So this operational period is building our communication schedule. Look at it from that perspective and think about it like goalposts. An example of that might look something like this. Here are some of the traditional things that you would be doing, and I'm just sort of giving this to you as an example. And again, think of the operational period like goalposts. So if our operational period is a 3-hour span of time, it started at 9, it's going to end at 12. So what you'll see at the very top on our communication schedule, we start where we have an incident management team IAP, that's the incident action planning session. We have one at 9, we're having it at 12, and we're going to basically in between then be able to fill in all of our briefings. So we'll always do an executive briefing right after we've done the planning session. We now actually have information together, and we actually can begin to develop comms. So very likely we'll brief our employees in some fashion, however we do that, whatever tools we use. We'll be utilizing and reaching our external stakeholders. We'll be actually updating our web page. We might be doing our traditional media or social media. And then, of course, we're going back to another planning session. But once you know the operational period, you can schedule all this. And so when people say to you, what's going on, we have a briefing coming at 11 or a briefing's going out at 10. And you can establish this entire schedule. It basically puts you in control instead of constantly being reactive. So this gets to the last part of my conversation with you today, which is about exercises. Exercises are so important. The only way that you know any of this works is by either having a disaster or doing an exercise. And I vote for the latter always rather than the former. It's so less stressful, and we actually get a chance to improve it. So communication exercises can be really, really important. And there's many different ways you can do these. First of all, you could do an exercise simply with communicators, and that's all you do is provide a scenario, and you give them a variety of communication challenges, and they are tasked with actually then having to respond. But it's just them. So it's pretty straightforward. You can develop a very simple narrative and probably get an exercise developed pretty quickly, certainly within a month. You can always, and of course, combine the crisis management team and the communicators and how they work together and how they are able to, again, coordinate messaging, get the approvals, etc. A social media exercise is really important. Things like developing Twitter responses or Facebook. It's really hard to think well and creatively in 140 characters. That takes practice, and it's important that that be actually exercised every time you do an exercise with your incident management team. One of my common and most favorite exercises to do is what I call rip from the news. And literally that's going through a newspaper, flipping until you come to a great story. Wow, this would be a great story for us. Literally have your communications team assembled, kind of look at that story. Oh my gosh, fiber optic cut, lost the internet for 24 hours. Or, oh my gosh, a sprinkler head just went off on our server farm, and whatever the example might be. And then give them the appropriate time to pull out their communication matrix, pull out their governance document, develop into 3 teams where they gather and verify, they coordinate and develop, and they actually disseminate and evaluate. Pretty simple. And then you need to really make sure that you're very facile with all your communication tools. So whether that's an emergency notification system, things such as social media, whatever it is, you need to make sure that people are really good at responding and utilizing those tools. So these are some of the deliverables that we ask for when we do exercises. And we ask and expect in our communications team to do, if not all of these, certainly a big part of them. So whether you have a hotline and what the messaging is for that, providing and preparing all of the emergency notification messaging to all of the stakeholders, going back to the matrix, developing text messaging. Again, 140 characters, always challenging. What's the website message? What's the press release? What's the press conference? And many of our exercises, we do press conferences to really get them to be on point and practice. What is the social media responses? So Facebook and Twitter. And so in an exercise, we will give them a zillion Twitter-related messages that they have to either look at and ignore or look at and respond to. What's the client message? What's the investor relations message? Now, in an exercise, you don't want them just to tell you what they would be saying. I expect them to write it. Hopefully, they're pulling out pre-existing templates, approved templates that they can actually utilize. But it's not helpful if all they do is say, I would say this. No, write it. I want to see what the messaging is. So when thinking about all of that, there's a couple of things I want to leave you with going forward. Timely and effective communication doesn't just happen. It is not magic. It takes careful planning. And you need to engage all of your executive and crisis management team and all of the communicators, not just the one who have communication in their title. It's really important that you think about how you're going to be organized. And I really would strongly encourage you to think about this idea of having a bigger tent called a JIC, of which you bring in more communicators together. And then lastly, I would really ask you to seriously, I beg you, to look at a governance document because it clearly delineates the three examples I gave you: emergency response, tactical messaging, and strategic messaging. Who has the authority to write and approve all of those, as well as a matrix about who talks to whom. So on that note, I'm going to hand it back to Jesse. And Jesse, I think Claudia's got some messaging for us as well.
Definitely. Great. Thank you so much, Regina. Great presentation. So really quickly before we move ahead to the Q&A, we got Claudia Dent will be presenting. And if you do have any questions for Regina, feel free to send them through right now in the questions panel. But Claudia, I wanted to pass over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jesse. And thank you, Regina, for taking us through all the best practices around critical communication and collaboration in emergency situations. What I would like to do is spend a little bit of time talking about how all the best practices that Regina talked about and the things to consider can easily be automated leveraging the Everbridge system. So, just one example of a timeline of a critical incident is, for example, a credit card data breach. This could be any kind of cybersecurity issue. It could be anything that degrades your company or causes you to have to reach out to many, many people. And these communications timelines, as Regina talked about, involve all different kinds of constituents. Not just your internal employees, your stakeholders, but also external customers, vendors, etc. So the question is, how can you best be prepared to handle a situation like this and have everything ready to go so that you've thought through a lot of your messaging around various different incidents that could possibly occur? And I think these are a lot of the elements that Regina talked about in her presentation. And this is the whole thought behind Everbridge incident communications and IT alerting, whether it's a major emergency incident or whether it's some kind of a cybersecurity threat. You can have predefined templates, for example, that automate communications around any kind of a topic. Any range of some low-impact routine event to some major cybersecurity event that actually takes your whole company's infrastructure down. And we have examples of customers that have leveraged us in those situations. So the first thing you need to automate is, well, what do you need to say and to who? So who are you communicating to? Well, you have a number of people that need to respond to emergency situations, and they may have on-call schedules. So how do you get the right person with the right skills who's actually on call? That all needs to be automated. Who are your stakeholders? Obviously, executives, other departments, marketing, etc. And then finally, who are your customers that will need to be involved as well? And then, well, how do you reach them? One thing that's really key is in some kind of an emergency situation, you may not have all of the communication pathways that you thought you might have. So having just one mode to reach out to all of these constituents is going to be a problem. For example, if it's a cybersecurity event, your entire infrastructure could be gone. So using email, not internal email, won't work. A great example of that is SONY, and we'll talk about that, where they literally could not use their own internal systems during a cybersecurity event. Likewise, let's take a natural disaster. Well, what happens if all the phone systems are down? Maybe landlines are broken, but cell towers are still working, etc. Having alternative communication methods for people ready to go, built into these templates, is critical. And then how do you collaborate across the board? Being able to have a one-click conference bridge to get all key people involved in a conversation and discussion is very, very helpful. And not having to set that up separately. Call people with the passcode. That can waste 20 minutes of critical time. Why not just push one button and have everyone who needs to be on the phone join instantly to the conference bridge? That's like 1 minute versus 20. Escalating. So what happens if your responders don't respond? Maybe it's a natural disaster and for some reason they're unreachable. Or maybe it's a cybersecurity issue and they for some reason did not respond. Being able to escalate based on rules, who needs to fill in, who needs to understand when the right resources aren't brought to bear is very, very important. And then being able to reach out to people for polling purposes. And this can be a number of things. Understanding if someone's busy and they can't respond, if it's the responders. If it's stakeholders, understanding who's safe and who isn't, if it's some kind of a natural disaster. So again, being able to automate all of these different scenarios and having the messaging, who needs to know, how you're going to reach them, and how you're going to collaborate, all set and ready to go based on all the principles that Regina talked about is really what Everbridge is all about, and helping you manage communications through these critical incidents. A great example of when entire infrastructure was brought down is the situation with SONY, which many of you I'm sure might remember. And SONY was an Everbridge customer, and they had many of their Everbridge employees already in the system with multiple communications paths. But when their infrastructure broke, they realized that they couldn't use their internal email. So having Everbridge was critical. And one of the things that the SONY CEO said to the media, and this had nothing to do with emergency, it wasn't even it was just on their general problem, was that if he had to do it all over again, he would have been much more religious about having more people and everyone on Everbridge. And I think that speaks a lot about the value and the importance of having a parallel infrastructure where Everbridge is a SaaS-oriented separate infrastructure so that if your infrastructure is compromised, you have the right pathways to reach out to many, many constituents. With that, I just want to summarize a little bit about Everbridge. We've been in the critical communications business for over 12 years now. This is our 11th straight year of growth as a market leader, and also, our 11th straight years as always being in the top of that Gartner Magic Quadrant. We're an incredibly scalable and global solution, so we send over 1 billion critical communications messages per year. We have over 100 million contacts managed around the world, and we have global data centers, etc. One of the major benefits of Everbridge is that ability to reach people around the world, no matter what time zone, etc. people are in, being able to have that scalability and assurance that Everbridge can deliver for you in a critical situation. With that, I'll just leave you with some of our key customers. We have over 25 enterprise customers across multiple markets, and we're growing rapidly. So this list is actually increasing every day. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jesse, and we will entertain some of your questions, and hopefully we'll have a chance to get through as many as we possibly can.
Great. Thank you, Claudia, and thank you again, Regina. Unfortunately, we are a little over time, so I'm going to limit this to 1 or 2 questions. First one that comes in is pointed to Regina, and it says, thank you for a superb and informative presentation. As a takeaway, could you underscore one mistake you see made most often so that we can avoid making it ourselves?
I think the biggest mistake that I see people make is they don't communicate because they don't think they have all or enough information. And I want to say that in most disasters, you won't know everything, or you won't know a lot of information, and for often hours, and maybe even days. So you should not fail to communicate because you don't think you know enough. What you can always communicate is that you know that something is going on, you're researching, you're responding, you're working with responders, which sounds like a broken record, but if that's all you know, that's worth saying. So please, please communicate, even if what you have to say may feel limited. Because if you don't, people don't even know that you have a clue about what's going on. So that would be my #1 suggestion.
Great. Thank you. And we're getting a bunch of questions asking about the slides and the recording. So just to remind you, yes, they will be sent out early next week to all registrants. So we will be sending those out likely on Monday. I'm going to get to one more question. I know we're still over time. It says to Regina and Claudia, in the event of a degraded or non-existent connectivity, what solutions do you recommend to clients?
That's a great question. I will just really just build on what Claudia said, and what I strongly recommend our clients, that you need an emergency notification system in order to be able to communicate effectively. If you don't, then your options become laborious. I mean, some of my clients will set up their own text messaging groups, but that's a pain. So if you can have some automated process in order to communicate with your stakeholders. And then my last thing I would say about that is use it widely. Most people only use an ENS for their employees, and I would just say to you, think bigger. Use it for all of your key stakeholders. That's what it's there for.
Yeah, and I would definitely say what Regina said. And also, again, remember that you want to provide for multimodal communications. So you want each contact to have a variety of different paths to reach them, whether it's SMS, landline, email, home email, etc. The more paths you have for someone, the more likely you can reach them in an emergency. Great.
All right. Well, we have a few more questions coming in, but unfortunately we are out of time. If you have any questions for Regina specifically, her on Twitter at Regina Phelps, and I believe on LinkedIn as well. I don't know, Regina, if you want to put a plug for other ways people can contact you.
Yeah, Twitter's good.
Great. And likewise, if you have a question for Claudia for Everbridge, feel free to reach out on our website. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you Regina and Claudia for a great webinar. We hope to see everyone again.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, Regina.